I pulled into the parking lot at 6:30 sharp, same as always. The gravel crunched under my tires as I found my usual spot near the main building, though calling it a parking lot was generous. More like a patch of dirt with white lines painted on it that had faded to barely visible suggestions. 12 empty spaces met me where there should have been occupied ones. 12 people who'd called in sick overnight, according to the message I'd gotten on my way in. That number sat wrong in my gut. Our facility ran on strict health protocols. You didn't just call out unless you were genuinely down for the count. Having that many people out at once meant either the worst flu outbreak in company history or something else entirely. I took my radio and security keys from the passenger seat, checking my watch. Sarah would be here in 10 minutes, assuming she hadn't gotten caught behind one of the coal trucks that sometimes used this road. Not that we actually mined coal here, but the trucks help sell our cover story to anyone who might be watching. The facility spread across 3 acres of Oklahoma prairie, all flat grassland and endless sky. Kenton barely qualified as a town, maybe 200 people on a good day, most of them ranchers or folks who worked the actual mining operations 30 miles south. That's exactly why the government picked this spot for our work. You could drive right past the turnoff and never know we existed. Hell, half the GPS systems didn't even show our access road. Inside the main building, fluorescent lights buzzed over sterile hallways that looked nothing like any coal operation I'd ever seen. Clean white walls, keycard readers on every door, and the kind of air filtration system that cost more than most people's houses. The employees who worked here had security clearances that took months to process. We weren't mining anything that came out of the ground naturally. I made it to the security office and started my morning routine. Checking overnight logs, reviewing camera feeds, testing radio channels. Everything looked normal on the monitors. Empty hallways, vacant break rooms, the laboratory wing quiet and still. Too quiet, maybe, but that could just be the reduced staff. Sarah's footsteps carried down the corridor before she appeared in the doorway, coffee cup in one hand and her equipment bag slung over her shoulder. She looked as tired as I felt. 12 people out sick, she said without any greeting. That's what, a quarter of our staff? 26%, I replied, having done the math on my drive in. And all of them called between midnight and 3 a.m. That part bothers me. Sarah dropped into the chair next to mine and pulled up the staff roster on her computer. Food poisoning from the company picnic last weekend? Possible, but we had medical clear everyone who attended. Plus, the timing feels off for that. I switched between camera angles, scanning the facility's interior. Could be coordinated. Coordinated sick leave? She raised an eyebrow. That's either the most elaborate union action in history, or you're getting paranoid in your old age. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was reading too much into a coincidence. But 15 years in security work had taught me that coincidences usually weren't. We ran through our standard morning checklist: perimeter cameras, motion sensors, door locks, emergency systems. Everything tested green across the board. Sarah reviewed the night shift reports while I prepared our equipment for the first perimeter walkthrough. We did 2 complete circuits every shift, checking fence lines and looking for anything that didn't belong. Radio check, Sarah said, adjusting her headset. Control to Unit 2. Unit 2, loud and clear, I responded, though we were sitting 3 feet apart. Protocol was protocol. The radio crackled with static, then a voice broke through that I didn't recognize. Male, distressed, words coming too fast to understand clearly. Something about staying put, not leaving the office, danger in the facility. Sarah and I locked eyes. She tried to respond, but the transmission cut off abruptly. "Who was that?" she asked. Before I could answer, screaming started from somewhere deep in the main building. Not one voice, multiple people overlapping, the kind of sounds that made your skin crawl because they didn't sound entirely human. I spun toward the monitor wall, switching quickly between camera feeds. The main laboratory came into view first, and what I saw there made no sense at all. People were collapsing. Dr. Hayes fell first, right in the middle of adjusting some piece of equipment I couldn't identify. Blood ran from his eyes and nose as he hit the floor, his body shaking like he was having a seizure. Then Rebecca from the research team went down. Same symptoms, same violent shaking. "Jesus Christ," Sarah whispered. More workers dropped throughout the laboratory wing. Some tried to run for the exits, but they only made it a few steps before whatever hit them took hold. Bodies hitting the floor, blood spreading across white tiles, arms and legs jerking in ways that looked wrong. Gunshots boomed through the building. 3 rapid pops, then silence. Sarah grabbed her radio. "Dispatch, this is Kenton Security requesting immediate medical and backup units. We have multiple casualties in the main facility. Unknown cause, appears to be some kind of medical emergency or contamination event." The response came back as static. I reached for the office door and turned the deadbolt, hearing it click into place. Then I activated the security system that would lock down our section of the building. Heavy steel plates dropped over our windows with metallic thuds. We were sealed in. "Try again," I told Sarah. She keyed the radio twice more, got nothing but empty air. On the monitors, more bodies lay motionless in the corridors. The break room camera showed 3 people who'd been sitting at tables, now sprawled on the floor in pools of blood. Whatever was happening, it had hit fast and spread through the entire facility in minutes. The building's automated lockdown system activated with a deep mechanical rumble. Red lights started flashing in every hallway visible on our screens. Steel barriers dropped across doorways. The air circulation system moved to emergency filtration mode, sealing the building from outside air. "Mike," Sarah said quietly, "look at camera 7. The hallway outside the chemistry lab was empty except for 4 bodies. But as I watched, one of them twitched, then another. Not the random muscle spasms you might expect from someone dying, but deliberate movement. They were trying to get up. Could be dying muscle contractions, I said, though I didn't believe it. All of them at once? She was right. 3 of the bodies were moving now, pushing themselves up from the floor with jerky, unnatural motions. Dr. Martinez stood first, his lab coat soaked with blood that had poured from his nose and eyes. He turned toward the camera, and I could see that his eyes had gone completely white. "That's not normal," Sarah said. The other bodies were getting up too. Janet from accounting swayed on her feet, blood covering the front of her blouse, same white eyes staring at nothing. Tom from maintenance stumbled against the wall, leaving a bloody handprint as he steadied himself. "Chemical leak," I said, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. "Has to be some kind of nerve agent or hallucinogen in the air system." But even as I said it, I knew that didn't explain why they'd fallen unconscious and then gotten back up. It didn't explain the blood or the way they were moving like broken puppets. On camera 12, I watched Dr. Hayes pull himself to his feet in the main lab. His glasses were gone, and blood had dried in streaks down his face. He stood there for maybe 10 seconds, perfectly still, then started walking toward the camera with that same jerky walk the others had. "The people who called in sick," Sarah said. "This wasn't random." I nodded, understanding hitting me all at once. 12 people missing from their posts, 12 people who should have been here when whatever happened went down, but who'd conveniently called out in the middle of the night. They'd known this was coming. "They released something into the ventilation system," I said. "Had to be during the night shift when skeleton crew was on duty." Sarah checked the environmental monitors on her computer. "Air quality readings are normal. No chemical alerts, no biological warnings. Whatever it was, our sensors can't detect it." The radio crackled again, that same distorted voice from before, but this time I could make out a few words. "Don't open the doors. They're not dead. Stay locked down until..." The transmission cut off. I stared at the monitors, watching people who should have been corpses wandering through our facility with vacant white eyes. The automated lockdown would keep us safe for now, but it also meant we were trapped in here with whatever those things had become. "How long until someone notices we missed our check-in?" Sarah asked. 6 hours, I replied. Maybe 8 if they assume we're dealing with the sick leave situation. She pulled her sidearm from its holster and checked the magazine. I did the same, though I wasn't sure bullets would help us against whatever was walking around out there. The scratching started a few minutes later. Soft at first, like someone dragging their fingernails across metal. It was coming from just outside our door. My radio had gone silent 40 minutes ago, and my watch showed 8:32. 2 hours since we'd locked ourselves in this office, watching our coworkers stumble through the hallways like broken marionettes. Sarah had stopped trying to raise anyone on the emergency channels after the 15th attempt yielded nothing but static. "We can't stay here forever," she said, checking her weapon for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. "Someone needs to know what happened here." The main communication array sat in the central hub, maybe 300 feet from our current position through the facility's main corridor. Under normal circumstances, it would take 2 minutes to reach. These weren't normal circumstances. I pulled 2 emergency gas masks from the supply cabinet, standard equipment for any potential chemical leak. The straps felt stiff and unfamiliar as I adjusted mine over my face, the plastic fogging slightly with each breath. Sarah did the same, her movements quick and practiced. If whatever had killed our co-workers was still in the air, these masks were our only protection. "Stay close," I said, my voice muffled through the filter. We moved fast and quiet. I unlocked the security door, hearing the deadbolt slide back with a metallic click that seemed impossibly loud. The hallway beyond lay empty, fluorescent lights making harsh shadows across white tile floors. Bloodstains marked the walls in irregular patterns, dark smears where bodies had slumped and slid before falling. We stepped out together, weapons drawn. The silence felt heavy, broken only by the facility's air circulation system cycling through emergency filtration mode. Our footsteps carried despite our attempts to move quietly, each sound bouncing off the sterile walls. The first body lay 15 feet down the corridor. Rebecca from the chemistry department sprawled face down in a pool of dried blood. But as we approached, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. A thin, pale appendage stuck out from behind her left ear, maybe 4 inches long and segmented like an earthworm. It moved slightly, pulsing with a rhythm that reminded me of a heartbeat. "Jesus," Sarah whispered. "Look at her head." More of them. Tiny worm-like creatures, each no thicker than a pencil, coming out from the skulls of every corpse we passed. Some had only one visible parasite. Others had 2 or 3 growing from different spots around their ears and the base of their necks. The creatures seemed to be controlling the bodies somehow, making them walk and move even after death. "Parasitic," Sarah said, her scientific training kicking in. "They have to be the specimens from the classified research wing, the ones we were told never to ask about." That made sense. Our facility handled more than basic research, and certain sections remained off-limits even to security personnel. If the government had been studying extraterrestrial organisms here, it would explain the unusual protocols and the level of secrecy surrounding some areas of the building. We reached the intersection where the main corridor split toward the communication hub. Bodies covered the floor in greater numbers here, 12 or 13 workers who'd apparently been caught together when whatever happened began. Each one displayed the same parasitic infestation, thin creatures extending from their skulls like ugly antennae. Dr. Martinez lay propped against the wall, his lab coat soaked with blood. His eyes had turned completely white, pupils gone, staring at nothing. The parasite emerging from his skull was longer than the others, nearly 6 inches and visibly pulsing. As we watched, his head turned toward us with a jerky, mechanical motion. "They're still alive," I said. Martinez pushed himself off the wall, getting to his feet with movements that looked like stop-motion animation. Each gesture came in separate, jerky motions rather than the smooth movement of a living person. His arms hung at weird angles, controlled by something that didn't understand human anatomy. other bodies began moving around. Janet from accounting rolled over and sat up, blood crusted around her nose and mouth. Tom from maintenance got to his knees, then stood unsteadily. All of them had those same white, empty eyes and parasitic things sticking out of their heads. Martinez opened his mouth and let out a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard from a human throat. Part scream, part metallic shriek, it bounced through the corridor and seemed to wake every infected worker nearby. Answering calls came from deeper in the facility, more of those inhuman sounds. "Run," Sarah said. We sprinted toward the communication room as infected workers came out from side hallways and doorways. They moved with that same jerky, puppet-like walk, but they were fast. Faster than should have been possible for corpses controlled by parasites. The communication hub's door stood open 50 feet ahead. We could make it if we didn't stop, if nothing else went wrong. Sarah pulled ahead of me, her smaller frame letting her move more quickly through the narrow hallway. She stumbled 20 feet from our destination, catching her foot on a piece of debris from the ceiling. I heard her gasp as she went down hard, her gas mask cracking against the tile floor. The plastic face shield split down the middle, breaking the seal. An infected worker jumped out from a doorway we hadn't seen, moving with hunting speed that seemed impossible for something controlled by a parasite. Dr. Hayes, the senior researcher I'd watched collapse on the monitors hours earlier. Blood had dried in streaks down his face, and the worm-like creature extending from his skull was nearly 8 inches long, thicker than the others. He grabbed Sarah before I could reach her, his fingers closing around her throat with mechanical precision. The parasite on his head turned toward her like a snake sensing prey, then shot forward with lightning speed. It went through the crack in her gas mask and disappeared into her ear canal in one smooth motion. I put 3 rounds into Hayes's chest, watching him stagger backward and fall. But it was already too late. Sarah screamed, a sound of pure agony that cut through me like broken glass. She clawed at her ear, trying to dig out whatever had entered, but her movements were becoming uncoordinated. The communication equipment filled an entire wall of the hub, banks of radio transmitters and satellite uplinks that could reach government emergency frequencies anywhere in the country. I turned on the main console and began broadcasting on the highest priority channels, while Sarah was having seizures on the floor behind me. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Kenton Research Facility requesting immediate government response. We have a containment breach of extraterrestrial specimens, multiple casualties, parasitic infection spreading through entire staff. Need hazmat teams and military backup immediately." I repeated the message twice more, then switched to different frequencies and transmitted our coordinates along with everything I knew about the creature's behavior and infection method. Someone had to know what was happening here, had to understand the threat these parasites represented. Sarah's convulsions stopped abruptly. I turned to see her sitting up, her back against the wall. Blood ran from her nose and the ear where the parasite had entered. But it was her eyes that confirmed what I already knew. Completely white, pupils gone, looking at me with the same vacant expression I'd seen on all the others. Something moved under the skin of her scalp, a visible bulge traveling from her ear toward the back of her head. The parasite was establishing itself, taking control of her nervous system the same way it had with everyone else. "Sarah," I said, though I knew she couldn't hear me anymore. She stood up with those same mechanical movements, head tilting at an unnatural angle. Her mouth opened and released that metallic shriek, calling to the other infected workers throughout the facility. I could hear them responding, getting closer. The thing that had been Sarah lunged at me with predatory speed. I shot her twice in the chest, watching her fall backward against the communication console. A thin, pale appendage began emerging from behind her left ear as her body hit the floor. I transmitted one final message, giving our exact location and warning anyone who might respond that the parasites could infect through the respiratory system and ear canals. Then I grabbed the emergency medical kit from the wall and went back toward the security office, knowing I was now completely alone in a facility full of creatures that had once been my co-workers. The scratching at the security door had stopped hours ago, but I could hear them moving through the corridors, searching, hunting, and I was the only living person left for them to find. I dragged myself back through the hallways, Sarah's blood still warm on my hands and uniform. The infected workers had scattered when the gunshots carried through the communication hub, but I could hear them regrouping somewhere deeper in the facility. Their metallic shrieks carried through the ventilation system, a sound that made my teeth ache. The security office door felt like salvation when I reached it, though my hands shook so badly I could barely work the keypad. The deadbolt slid home with a solid click, followed by the whir of steel plates dropping back over the windows. I was sealed in again, but this time I was alone. My reflection in the monitor screens showed a man I barely recognized. Blood spattered across my face and chest, some of it from the creatures I'd shot, some from Sarah. Her blood. I'd killed my partner. Watched that thing emerge from her skull, pulled the trigger while she wore her face. The scratching started again within minutes, but different this time. More deliberate, more organized. Through the door's reinforced glass, I could see pale appendages testing the seals around the frame. The parasites were checking our defenses, learning our weaknesses. I turned to the monitors and began cycling through every camera in the facility. The infected workers moved through the hallways in groups now, no longer the random wandering I'd seen earlier. They seemed to be following some kind of pattern, covering every section of the building step by step. Whatever intelligence controlled those parasites was adapting, organizing. The main laboratory appeared on camera 12, and I saw something I'd missed before. Computer terminals were still active, screens displaying research data that scrolled past too quickly to read from this distance. If I could access the facility's central database from here, maybe I could understand what we'd been dealing with. My fingers moved across the security system's keyboard, bypassing normal protocols with my administrative access. The facility's research network opened to me in layers of classified files, most requiring clearance levels I didn't have. But emergency protocols had kicked in during the lockdown, and some restrictions had been lifted automatically. Project designation, specimen recovery analysis, Nevada Site 7. The files contained hundreds of documents, video recordings, and biological samples data. Dr. Richard Hayes had been the lead researcher, documenting everything they'd found about the creatures since their arrival 6 months ago. According to his reports, the specimens had been recovered from a crash site in the Nevada desert, along with other materials that remained classified above my clearance level. I opened the most recent video log, dated just 3 days before the outbreak. Dr. Hayes appeared on screen in his lab coat, looking directly into the camera with tired eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Day 173 of specimen analysis, he began. We've confirmed that the organisms demonstrate unprecedented neurological infiltration capabilities. Once introduced into a host nervous system, they establish complete motor control within minutes while maintaining basic life functions in the body. The video showed microscopic footage of the parasites attacking neural tissue, their segmented bodies extending filaments that wrapped around nerve clusters like tiny fingers. The speed of infiltration was remarkable, covering major brain sections before the host's immune system could mount any response. The specimens appear to retain some form of collective intelligence, Hayes continued. Individual parasites coordinate their actions even when separated from the primary cluster. This suggests a form of biological networking that we don't fully understand. I paused the recording and checked the facility's staff medical records, cross-referencing them with the 12 employees who'd called in sick. Every one of them had visited the medical wing for routine blood work during the past month. Everyone had been flagged for follow-up appointments that never happened. The pieces clicked together in my mind like a puzzle I should have solved weeks ago. The missing employees hadn't called in sick. They'd been infected, turned into sleeper agents while the parasites established control. They'd waited for the right moment, then coordinated their attack when Skeleton Crew was on duty. More video logs showed the scope of what they'd been studying. The Nevada crash site had yielded dozens of these creatures along with technology that remained beyond our understanding. Similar facilities existed across the country, each working on different parts of what the government called recovered materials. Our facility specialized in biological specimens, while others studied engineering applications or communication systems. Hayes's final log entry was dated the morning of the outbreak. His voice carried a tension I hadn't noticed in earlier recordings. We've detected unusual activity in Containment Unit 7. The specimens appear to be responding to some external stimulus, possibly electromagnetic. I've recommended enhanced security protocols, but management wants to proceed with scheduled testing. I'm concerned we don't fully understand the organism's capabilities. The external stimulus had been the infected employees. They'd somehow signaled the contained specimens to activate, breaking free during the planned chaos when most staff was absent. The whole thing had been planned from the inside by people who were no longer fully human. I began transmitting everything to government emergency frequencies, uploading Hayes's research files along with my detailed observations of the outbreak. Someone needed to understand what these creatures could do, how they spread, how they organized. If they ever reached a populated area, the infection could become unstoppable. The clawing at the door got worse as night went deeper, along with new sounds I couldn't identify. Metallic tapping, like the parasites were using tools to work at the reinforced seals. Through the monitors, I watched them carefully exploring every inch of the facility, learning its layout, understanding its systems. Camera 14 showed 3 infected workers standing motionless in the main corridor, their heads tilted at identical angles. The parasites extending from their skulls moved in perfect sync, writhing together like some kind of biological antenna array. They were communicating, sharing information about their search for me. I transmitted updates every hour, describing the creature's behavior and documenting their apparent intelligence. The radio waves went out into the darkness of the Oklahoma prairie, carrying warnings that might be the difference between containment and catastrophe. Around midnight, the scratching stopped suddenly. The sudden silence felt more scary than the constant noise had been. Through the monitors, I watched the infected workers retreat from the security wing, moving deeper into the facility with that same coordinated precision. Then I heard vehicles outside, heavy engines, multiple trucks moving across the gravel parking lot. Lights swept across the facility's exterior as helicopters circled overhead, their rotors cutting through the night air. My radio crackled to life with a clear, authoritative voice. Kenton Security. This is Agent Jennifer Clark with the CDC Biological Containment Unit. We received your transmissions and are establishing a perimeter. Stay in your current position and do not attempt to leave the building until we've secured the area. Relief flooded through me so completely that I nearly collapsed. They'd heard my messages, understood the threat, brought the kind of response this situation required. Professional help was finally here. Through the outside cameras, I watched teams in full biological protection suits moving across the grounds. They carried weapons I didn't recognize. Advanced equipment designed for exactly this kind of situation. Military vehicles surrounded the building while helicopters maintained overwatch patterns. Agent Clark, this is Michael Thompson. I'm secure in the main security office. Be advised, the infected are still active throughout the facility. They appear to coordinate their movements and demonstrate advanced problem-solving capabilities. Copy that, Thompson. We're tracking approximately 37 infected individuals through thermal imaging. Our teams are trained for this type of containment. Maintain your position and monitor our progress through your camera system. The infected workers seem to sense the approaching threat. Through the monitors, I watched them abandon their systematic search and begin moving toward the facility's exits. But the government teams were ready, cutting off escape routes with practiced efficiency. What followed was careful elimination, carried out by professionals who clearly understood what they were dealing with. Each infected worker was isolated and neutralized with precise headshots that destroyed the parasites along with their hosts. No chances were taken, no infected individual was allowed to escape. The operation lasted until dawn, teams moving through every corridor and room to ensure complete containment. Bodies were secured in special containment units, and the entire facility was treated with some kind of chemical agent that neutralized any remaining parasitic material. As the first pale light came through the exterior cameras, Agent Clark's voice returned to my radio. "Thompson, we're ready for your extraction. Exit through the main corridor and proceed to the front entrance. Medical teams are standing by for decontamination and health assessment." I unlocked the security office door for the first time in almost 12 hours, stepping into hallways that now had only government people in protective suits. The infected workers were gone, their bodies removed or destroyed. The facility felt empty in a way that went beyond just not having people around. 2 technicians in hazmat gear walked me outside, where a mobile medical unit waited under the brightening sky. I was alive, rescued, and the immediate threat was contained. But as they took me toward decontamination, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd seen here was just the beginning of something much bigger. The decontamination chamber felt like being trapped inside a car wash designed for humans. Chemical sprays hit me from multiple angles while technicians in hazmat suits monitored readings on equipment I couldn't identify. My clothes went into a sealed container marked with biohazard symbols, replaced by a disposable jumpsuit that smelled like industrial disinfectant. They moved me to a mobile medical facility parked beside the main building, where Dr. Patricia Reeves began the first of what would become dozens of blood draws over the following days. Her latex gloves snapped as she tied off the tourniquet around my upper arm, the needle sliding into my vein with practiced efficiency. "We need to run comprehensive panels," she explained, filling multiple vials with dark red blood. "Parasitic organisms, bacterial infections, viral markers, heavy metals, chemical exposure. The works." Agent Clark watched from a corner of the medical unit, still wearing her protective suit, but with the hood pulled back. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled into a tight ponytail, and she took notes on a tablet while Dr. Reeves worked. She had the kind of face that gave away nothing, professional neutrality that came from years of managing situations like this. "How long will the testing take?" I asked. "Minimum of 72 hours for initial results," Dr. Reeves said. "Full analysis could run a week or more. We're dealing with unknown biological agents, so we can't rush the process." They transported me to a government medical facility outside Oklahoma City, a place that looked like a standard hospital from the outside but had security measures that reminded me of the Kenton site. Keycard readers on every door, guards who carried sidearms, windows that looked bulletproof. My room was comfortable enough. Private bathroom, television, decent food. But the door locked from the outside and cameras watched my every movement. On the second day, Agent Clark began the formal debriefing sessions. She showed up each morning at 9 o'clock sharp, carrying a briefcase and wearing business suits that suggested she did this kind of work regularly. Her questions were thorough and methodical, covering every detail of the outbreak from the moment I'd gotten to work until the government teams got me out. "Tell me again about the 12 employees who called in sick," she said, pen poised over a legal pad. "Did any of them exhibit unusual behavior in the weeks before the incident?" I walked her through my observations, the coordinated timing of their absences, the fact that all had visited medical for routine blood work, the way their sick calls had come during a narrow window when skeleton crew was on duty. Clark's expression remained neutral, but she took extensive notes about each detail. "Those employees were compromised during an earlier containment failure," she said on the third day. "Management made the decision to cover up the initial breach rather than report it through proper channels. They thought they could handle the situation internally." "How long were they infected before the outbreak?" "We estimate between 3 and 6 weeks. The parasites can remain dormant while establishing neural pathways, then activate when triggered by external stimuli. In this case, that trigger was a coordinated electromagnetic pulse generated by the infected employees themselves." The scope of the operation started becoming clear through her explanations. The creatures weren't just random specimens. They were part of a larger collection of extraterrestrial materials recovered from multiple crash sites across the southwestern United States. The government had been studying them for years through a network of classified facilities, each focusing on different aspects of the alien technology. "How many other sites are there?" I asked. Clark hesitated before answering. "That information is classified above your current clearance level. What I can tell you is that biological specimens like the ones at Kenton represent only one category of recovered materials. Other facilities study propulsion systems, communication devices, metallurgy applications. On the fourth day, Dr. Reeves delivered preliminary test results that confused everyone involved. My blood showed no traces of parasitic infection, no unusual antibodies, no indication that I'd been exposed to anything more dangerous than routine environmental contamination. But more puzzling was what the tests didn't show. Any evidence of immunity markers that might explain why I'd remained uninfected when Sarah hadn't. "Your partner was exposed for the same duration in the same environment," Dr. Reeves explained, reviewing lab reports with a frown. "She was wearing an identical gas mask that failed in the same way yours did. There's no medical reason why the parasite should have targeted her instead of you." Agent Clark seemed particularly interested in this part of my case. She brought in more specialists who ran more advanced tests, genetic analysis, brain scans, blood chemistry workups that needed equipment I'd never seen before. Every result came back normal, showing a perfectly healthy 35-year-old male with no weird traits. "The creatures demonstrate remarkable intelligence in host selection," Clark said during our session on day 6. "They can assess potential targets and choose the most suitable candidates for infection. It's possible you possessed some quality they found undesirable." The thought that I'd been looked at and rejected by parasitic aliens felt almost insulting. Sarah had been younger, faster, probably in better shape. Maybe they just picked the better host when they had choices. Clark's final briefing came on the 7th day, delivered in a conference room with better furniture and no visible cameras. She laid out documents that needed my signature: non-disclosure agreements, psychological evaluation waivers, financial compensation forms. The numbers involved were big enough to let me live comfortably without working for several years. "The facility is being demolished completely," she said, sliding papers across the table. "Every structure will be reduced to rubble, and the entire site will be sealed with concrete barriers. All biological specimens have been incinerated at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees. What about other facilities? Are they still operating?" "That's not your concern anymore, Mr. Thompson. Your involvement in this matter ends when you sign these documents and accept our offer of relocation assistance." The relocation package included a new identity if I wanted it, housing assistance anywhere in the continental United States, and monthly payments disguised as disability benefits. All I had to do was agree never to speak about what I'd witnessed at Kenton, never to contact other government personnel about the incident, and never to return to the area around the facility. "What happens if I refuse?" Clark's expression didn't change, but something in her tone grew colder. "The national security implications of this incident are considerable, Mr. Thompson. The government has various legal tools available to ensure compliance with classified material restrictions. I signed the papers because refusing seemed pointless. They had enough leverage to destroy my life if I became a problem, and the money would let me disappear somewhere safe while I figured out what came next. But the whole arrangement felt like a transaction rather than a reward. They were buying my silence, not expressing gratitude for my service. The psychological counseling they arranged turned out to be Dr. Amanda Foster, a woman in her 50s who specialized in trauma related to classified government operations. She had an office in downtown Oklahoma City and scheduled me for weekly sessions that were supposedly voluntary but felt mandatory given the circumstances. "Post-traumatic stress from incidents like yours requires ongoing management," Dr. Foster explained during our first meeting. "The government wants to ensure you have proper support systems in place. Agent Clark would be doing monthly check-ins as well, supposedly to watch my adjustment and make sure I had everything I needed. But her questions always seemed to focus on my physical and mental health, whether I'd had any unusual symptoms, if I'd noticed any changes in my behavior or thought patterns. They let me go on a gray Tuesday morning with a check for $50,000 and a business card with Clark's direct phone number. A government driver took me to a rental car lot where I picked up a sedan that would carry me back to my house outside Tulsa. The paperwork was already done, the keys waiting at the customer service desk. The drive across eastern Oklahoma felt weird after a week of medical facilities and briefing sessions. Normal traffic, normal people going about their normal lives, none of them knowing that parasitic aliens had nearly gotten out just a few hundred miles from where they lived and worked. The radio played country music and commercial ads for car dealerships, creating a soundtrack that felt disconnected from everything I'd been through. My house sat at the end of a gravel road 15 miles outside Tulsa, surrounded by oak trees that gave me privacy from the nearest neighbors. I'd bought the place specifically for its isolation, wanting space to decompress after long hours at high-security facilities. Now that isolation felt like the only thing standing between me and a world that suddenly seemed full of potential threats. I parked in the driveway and sat in the rental car for several minutes, looking at my own front door. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it a week ago. Porch light off, newspapers piled where the delivery service had continued dropping them, mail overflowing from the box beside the door. But something felt wrong in a way I couldn't identify. Clark had mentioned other facilities studying different aspects of the recovered alien technology. If these creatures were just one part of a larger collection, how many other sites contained similar biological specimens? How could the government guarantee that management at those locations wouldn't make the same mistakes that led to the Kenton outbreak? And if the parasites were intelligent enough to coordinate attacks and evaluate potential hosts, wouldn't they also be capable of learning from their failures? The next containment breach might involve creatures that had adapted to overcome the government's countermeasures. I got out of the rental car and walked to my front door, fishing house keys from my pocket. The lock turned smoothly, the familiar creak of hinges welcoming me back to a place that no longer felt like home. My living room looked smaller than I remembered, the furniture arranged exactly as I'd left it, but somehow foreign. The blinking light on my answering machine showed 23 messages, most of them probably from my brother David, wondering why I hadn't returned his calls. I pressed play and listened to his voice, growing increasingly worried over the span of a week, asking about my job, my health, whether something had happened to me. I deleted all the messages without returning any calls. Clark had arranged for my mail to be forwarded during the quarantine, and a stack of letters waited on my kitchen table. Bills, ads, a few personal notes from coworkers who didn't know I'd quit my job or why. Everything felt like correspondence from a previous life, addressed to someone I'd been before, watching Sarah transform into something inhuman. The government's story was neat and complete. Alien specimens contained, saboteurs eliminated, facility destroyed, threat neutralized. But if everything was truly resolved, why did they need to watch my health so closely? Why the ongoing psychological evaluation and monthly check-ins with Agent Clark? I walked through my house room by room, checking windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. The isolation I'd once valued now felt like vulnerability. If other facilities existed and other outbreaks occurred, I would be completely cut off from information that might be essential for survival. But I'd signed their papers and taken their money, legally binding myself to silence about the most important thing that had ever happened to me. The parasites might be destroyed, but the government's web of secrecy and misdirection would continue indefinitely. I locked my front door and turned off all the lights, then sat in my living room watching the darkness beyond the windows. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to each other across the Oklahoma hills. Normal sounds from a normal night in a world where I would never feel normal again. I couldn't sleep that first night back in my own bed. Every sound outside made me reach for the pistol I'd started keeping on the nightstand, listening to wind through the oak trees and wondering if something else might be moving out there in the darkness. The mattress felt strange, like furniture in a hotel room rather than the bed I'd owned for 3 years. By morning, I knew I wouldn't be returning to work. The thought of being around other people, in closed spaces, sharing air that might carry tiny threats I couldn't see, it made my skin crawl. I called my supervisor at the energy company where I'd picked up a job after leaving government security, telling him I needed extended medical leave for complications from a workplace accident. The lie came easily, and he didn't ask for details. 3 days later, I drove to the hardware store in town and bought everything I needed to turn my house into a fortress. Dead bolt locks for every exterior door, motion sensor lights for the perimeter, security cameras with night vision that I could monitor from my computer. The old clerk who rang up my purchases made small talk about home security, mentioning how smart it was to protect yourself these days. I nodded and paid in cash, avoiding his eyes. Installing the cameras took most of a week. I positioned them to cover every approach to the house, with overlapping views that got rid of blind spots. The monitor set up in my bedroom let me check all angles without leaving the room, and I found myself watching those feeds for hours at a time. Deer wandered across the screen sometimes, and once a raccoon set off the motion sensors, but mostly I stared at empty images of my own driveway and yard. The first month passed in a blur of routine inspections. Every morning I looked at my body in the bathroom mirror, looking for any sign that the parasites had somehow taken hold, even though the government's test results were clean. I checked behind my ears with a hand mirror, feeling for unusual bumps or movements under my scalp. Any headache sent me into panic mode, convinced that something was digging through my brain tissue. I stopped showering regularly because the feeling of water running past my ears made me worried about parasitic entry points. Instead, I cleaned myself with antiseptic wipes, scrubbing until my skin turned red and raw. The smell of the chemicals became comforting in a way that probably wasn't healthy. Groceries arrived twice a week through an online delivery service. I told them that everything should be left at the end of my driveway, then waited until the delivery truck left before getting the bags. Canned goods became my primary food source because I could check every container for damage before opening it. Fresh produce might have tiny organisms, so I avoided anything that couldn't be thoroughly cooked. My phone rang constantly during those first weeks. David calling from Kansas City, concerned about my silence. Other family members left messages asking about my health, my job, whether something had happened to me. I listened to every voicemail but never picked up, convinced that staying away was the only way to protect them. If I was somehow infected, if the government tests had missed something, contact with loved ones could spread whatever was inside me. Sleep became a battle. I lost most nights. When exhaustion finally knocked me unconscious, nightmares dragged me back to the facility corridors. I watched Sarah change over and over, her face going from human to something controlled by pale things. Sometimes the dreams changed details. Instead of Sarah, it was David whose eyes turned white, or my mother whose skull split open to reveal writhing parasites. I developed a nightly ritual of checking every lock and camera feed before trying to rest. The loaded pistol stayed within arm's reach, safety off, ready for immediate use. Not against intruders from outside, but against whatever I might become if the parasites turned on inside my body. 3 bullets would be enough. 2 to destroy any organism trying to come out of my skull. 1 for myself if I was too far gone to think clearly. Dr. Foster continued scheduling our weekly sessions, calling my house when I stopped showing up at her office. I told her the isolation was temporary, that I needed time to process what had happened before returning to normal social interaction. She offered to conduct sessions over the phone, but even that felt like too much contact with the outside world. The trauma you experienced can manifest in various ways, she said during one of our brief conversations. Avoidance behaviors are common, but extended isolation can become counterproductive to healing. I hung up before she could finish explaining why I needed to rejoin society. Healing required staying alive long enough to understand what I was dealing with, and that meant keeping myself isolated until I was absolutely certain the parasites were gone. Agent Clark's monthly check-ins began 2 months after my release from the medical facility. She called promptly on the 15th of each month, always between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, asking the same basic questions about my physical and mental condition. Had I experienced any unusual symptoms? Any changes in appetite, sleep patterns, or cognitive function? Any new medical concerns I wanted to discuss? Her tone remained professionally neutral, but something about the questions felt wrong. If the government was truly confident that all specimens had been destroyed and all threats eliminated, why did they need such detailed updates on my health? Why did she always ask specifically about neurological symptoms, headaches, vision changes, problems with coordination or balance? These check-ins are standard procedure for anyone exposed to classified biological materials, Clark explained when I finally asked directly. We want to ensure you have proper support and that any delayed reactions are identified quickly. Delayed reactions. The phrase stuck in my mind for days after she said it, confirming what I'd already suspected. The government wasn't entirely certain the parasites were gone. They were monitoring me because I represented a potential vector for renewed infection, someone who might develop symptoms weeks or months after initial exposure. I started researching everything I could find about parasitic organisms, reading medical journals and biology textbooks that I ordered online. Most Earth-based parasites had predictable life cycles and infection patterns, but the creatures from Kenton operated according to completely different rules. Their ability to control host nervous systems suggested a level of biological sophistication that challenged everything science understood about parasitic relationships. The research showed disturbing possibilities I hadn't considered. Some earthly parasites could remain dormant in host tissue for extended periods, activating only when environmental conditions became favorable. If the alien specimens possessed similar capabilities, they might be waiting inside me for some unknown trigger before beginning their infiltration process. I began testing my reflexes daily, checking my coordination and mental clarity for any signs of neural interference. Simple exercises like touching my nose with my eyes closed, reciting the alphabet backwards, or solving basic math problems. Any hesitation or confusion might indicate that something was affecting my brain function. The loaded pistol became a constant companion, moving from room to room with me throughout the day. I practiced drawing and aiming until the motion became automatic, rehearsing the moment I might need to use it on myself. The safety remained off because infected individuals might only have seconds between recognizing their condition and losing control to the parasites. By the 4th month, my weight had dropped 20 pounds from poor diet and constant stress. My hair was growing longer than I'd ever worn it because leaving the house for a haircut felt impossibly dangerous. I looked like someone recovering from a serious illness, which wasn't entirely inaccurate. Clark's calls became more probing as time passed. She wanted to know if I'd had any contact with other people, whether I'd noticed anything unusual in my local area, if I'd heard from any former co-workers who might have questions about the Kenton facility. Her interest in my social isolation seemed to go beyond standard psychological evaluation. Maintaining some level of human contact is important for mental health, she said during our 6th monthly conversation. Have you considered reconnecting with family members? Your brother David has been asking about your welfare. The mention of David made my blood run cold. If Clark knew about my brother's calls, she was watching my communications more than she'd said. And if she was encouraging me to make contact with family, it might be because the government wanted to see how infection spread between individuals. I'm not ready for that yet, I told her. The trauma is still too fresh. Of course, but remember that support systems are crucial for recovery. Isolation can sometimes create more problems than it solves. After hanging up, I disconnected my landline phone and turned off my cell, cutting the last official link between myself and the outside world. If the government wanted updates on my condition, they could conduct surveillance from a distance rather than trying to manipulate me into exposing others to potential infection. The silence that followed felt like freedom for the first time in months. No more concerned family members asking questions I couldn't answer. No more medical professionals offering help I didn't trust. No more government agents probing for information about my mental state. Just me, my security cameras, and the loaded pistol that represented my final line of defense against becoming something inhuman. But the isolation also made every paranoid thought louder, until I could barely tell the difference between rational caution and complete madness. When autumn arrived and leaves began falling past my cameras, I convinced myself that each shadow might be hiding infected individuals who'd escaped government containment. Every sound in the night became evidence that the parasites had somehow tracked me to my house. I stopped sleeping entirely for 3 days straight, surviving on coffee and nervous energy while monitoring the camera feeds around the clock. When exhaustion finally forced me unconscious, I had nightmares about Agent Clark's voice asking questions that never seemed to end, each one designed to extract information I didn't know I possessed. The most terrifying possibility was that I represented some kind of test case, someone they were watching to understand how the parasites might behave in a host who showed initial resistance to infection. Maybe the clean blood tests hadn't meant I was safe. Maybe they'd meant I was something else entirely, a carrier who could spread the organisms without showing obvious symptoms. I practiced with the pistol until the motions became instinctive, ready to end the threat I might represent before anyone else could be endangered. The isolation had to continue indefinitely, no matter how much it cost my mental health or relationships with family. Protecting others from potential infection was more important than my own comfort or happiness. Months passed in this routine of paranoid vigilance and self-imposed quarantine. I became an expert at checking my own vital signs for any indication of parasitic activity, testing my reflexes and mental clarity multiple times each day. The loaded pistol remained within reach at all times, insurance against becoming the kind of creature I'd watched destroy my co-workers at Kenton. And through it all, David continued leaving messages on the disconnected phone, his voice growing more worried with each unanswered call. The calendar on my kitchen wall still showed October, even though February had arrived with its usual Oklahoma unpredictability. I'd stopped marking days sometime in December, when the routine of drawing X's through numbered squares felt like counting down to something I couldn't name. Time moved differently when you never left the house, measured not in weeks or months, but in the intervals between Agent Clark's calls and the cycles of deer crossing my security cameras. 6 months. That's how long I'd been living like this, watching the world through electronic eyes while my body slowly ate away at itself. The bathroom scale showed 148 pounds this morning, down from my normal 170. My reflection looked like someone recovering from cancer treatment, hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, hair that had grown past my shoulders because stepping outside for a haircut meant potential exposure to God knew what. The security monitors took over my bedroom now, 6 screens arranged in a semicircle around the chair where I spent most of my waking hours. Camera feeds showed every approach to the house in high-definition clarity, motion sensors triggering recordings that I went through obsessively for signs of anything unusual. Mostly I watched squirrels and the occasional delivery truck dropping packages at the end of my driveway, but paranoia had taught me that threats could hide in the most ordinary movements. David's car appeared on camera 3 around 2 in the afternoon. The same blue Honda he'd been driving when I last saw him at Christmas dinner 2 years ago. This was his second visit since I'd started my isolation, the first having happened in November when he'd spent an hour pounding on my front door and shouting questions I couldn't answer. Through the monitor, I watched him park in my driveway and sit behind the wheel for several minutes, probably gathering courage for another confrontation. He climbed out, wearing jeans and a heavy coat, looking around at the security cameras with an expression that mixed concern with growing frustration. At 30, David still carried himself like the college athlete he'd been, broad shoulders and confident stride that made people trust him instinctively. Seeing him through the electronic barrier of the monitor screen felt like watching a movie about someone I used to know. My phone had been disconnected for 3 months, but David tried calling anyway, holding his cell to his ear while standing directly in front of my door. When that failed, He knocked with the measured persistence of someone who knew I was inside but wouldn't give up easily. Through the audio pickup, I could hear him talking to the door. "Mike, I know you're in there. Your truck's in the driveway, and I can see the cameras moving when I walk around. Whatever happened at your job, whatever's going on, we can work through it. You don't have to handle this alone." I held onto the arms of my chair and forced myself to stay still. Every instinct told me to let him inside, to tell him everything about the parasites and the government cover-up and the fear that had taken over my life. But David had everything I was trying to protect. He had a normal job, normal friends, a normal life that could be destroyed if I brought him into contact with whatever might still be hiding inside me. He tried the windows next, pressing his hands against the glass and looking through gaps in the curtains. The security system had steel plates that could drop over the windows at the touch of a button, but using them would show that I was actively avoiding him rather than simply being gone. Instead, I watched him move from window to window, his breath fogging the glass as he looked for any sign of movement inside. After 40 minutes, he gave up and went back to his car. But instead of driving away, he sat in the driveway with his phone out, typing something that looked like a text message or email. The Honda's engine stayed off, which meant he planned to wait for a response that wouldn't come. My disconnected phone meant his messages were disappearing into digital space, but he couldn't know that. Finally, around 4 o'clock, David started his engine and backed out of the driveway. Camera 6 followed his car down the gravel road until it disappeared around the bend toward town. I stayed in my monitoring chair for another hour, checking and rechecking the feeds to make sure he wasn't coming back for another try. This had become my life. Careful isolation interrupted by people who cared enough to try reaching me, but couldn't understand why I wouldn't respond. David's visits were the hardest to ignore because his worry was real, and his persistence reminded me of the relationship we'd once had. Before Kenton, before the parasites, before I'd learned that staying close to people you loved could get them killed. The loaded pistol sat on the table beside my chair, safety off, ready for immediate use. During the worst nights, when exhaustion and paranoia combined to convince me that something was moving under my scalp, I'd held that gun for hours while staring at my reflection in the blank monitor screens. 3 bullets stayed in the cylinder, enough to handle any parasitic emergence, and still have one left for myself if necessary. Sleep came in pieces now, 30-minute intervals where exhaustion beat paranoia long enough for unconsciousness to take hold. The nightmares always had the same themes: Sarah's transformation, infected coworkers with white eyes and pale appendages, David calling my name while blood poured from his ears. I'd wake with my hand already reaching for the pistol, convinced that the dreams were memories of things that hadn't happened yet. Food had become fuel rather than pleasure. Canned goods heated on the stove and eaten without attention to taste or texture. My appetite had disappeared sometime around Christmas, replaced by the mechanical understanding that my body needed calories to maintain basic functions. Crackers and soup, beans and rice, whatever could be thoroughly cooked to eliminate any potential contamination. The research I'd done during my early months of isolation had shown disturbing possibilities about parasitic life cycles and dormancy periods. Some organisms could stay inactive in host tissue for years before receiving activation signals from environmental triggers or other infected individuals. The clean blood tests might have meant I was safe, or they might have meant the parasites were simply too small or too dormant for current detection methods. Agent Clark's calls had stopped in December after I disconnected the phone, but I assumed she was monitoring my credit card purchases and online activity. The government knew exactly where I was and what I was doing, probably maintaining surveillance to make sure I didn't become a security risk. As long as I stayed isolated and posed no threat to their cover story, they would leave me alone to manage my paranoia in private. What I didn't know was that David had begun his own investigation into my last known employment. While I watched my security monitors and counted down the bullets in my pistol, my brother was digging through tax records and government databases, following paper trails that led to questions I'd legally agreed never to answer. He'd started with the obvious approaches, calling my former supervisor at the energy company, reaching out to coworkers who might know why I'd taken extended medical leave. But those conversations had yielded nothing useful, just confirmation that I'd stopped showing up to work without explanation and that management assumed I was dealing with a personal crisis. The real breakthrough had come through property tax records that listed my previous employer as a mining operation in Kenton, Oklahoma. Public documents showed the facility had been permanently closed following a gas leak accident, with environmental cleanup handled by federal contractors under emergency protocols. But David's background in journalism had taught him to look for inconsistencies in official narratives, and the Kenton story contained several elements that didn't quite fit. Local newspaper archives mentioned unusual military activity in the area around the time of the supposed gas leak. Residents reported helicopters circling the facility for several days, along with convoys of unmarked trucks that came and went during nighttime hours. For a simple industrial accident, the government response seemed way too large and secretive. David had also found medical records showing that several cleanup workers had been hospitalized with mysterious symptoms weeks after the facility closure. The official explanation blamed chemical exposure from the mining operation, but the symptoms, neurological problems, coordination issues, behavioral changes, didn't match typical industrial poisoning patterns. While I maintained my isolated vigil in Tulsa, David was connecting dots that led to uncomfortable questions about what had really happened at the Kenton facility. He'd made copies of every document he could find, building a file that suggested the government's story contained significant gaps and contradictions. The decision to visit Kenton himself had become clear during a sleepless night in early February, when David realized that waiting for me to explain the situation voluntarily was pointless. If he wanted to understand what had traumatized his brother so severely, he would have to investigate the source directly. I had no awareness of his research or his growing suspicions about the facility. My world had contracted to the boundaries of my property, measured in camera angles and motion sensor readings, rather than the larger questions that were driving David toward answers I'd never wanted him to find. The routine continued unchanged, checking the monitors, testing my reflexes, watching for any sign that the parasites were beginning their activation sequence. The loaded pistol stayed within reach, my final insurance against becoming the kind of threat that had destroyed my coworkers at Kenton. But David was no longer content to accept my silence as a permanent condition. He was planning a trip to Kenton, convinced that seeing the abandoned facility would provide the answers I refused to give him. While I focused on protecting him through isolation, he was moving toward the very danger I'd spent 6 months trying to keep at bay. I'd been tracking David's credit card activity for 3 weeks, not out of any desire to invade his privacy, but because his unexpected visit in February had triggered every paranoid instinct I'd developed over the past 6 months. People who cared about me represented potential vectors for the kind of contamination that had destroyed the Kenton facility, and David's persistence in trying to reach me suggested he wasn't going to accept my silence indefinitely. My government security background had taught me how to monitor financial transactions and public records without leaving electronic footprints. David's spending patterns painted a clear picture of someone conducting research rather than living his normal life. Gas purchases traced a route from Kansas City to Oklahoma and back. Hotel charges in small towns near the facility location. Most troubling were the payments to public records offices and local newspapers, the kind of purchases someone made when they were digging into stories that weren't supposed to be told. The confirmation came through a news alert I'd set up to monitor any mentions of Kenton, Oklahoma. A local resident had posted on social media about seeing someone taking pictures near the old mining site, describing a man who matched David's description perfectly. The post included a grainy photo of a blue Honda parked outside the facility's perimeter fence. I stared at that image for 20 minutes, watching my brother's car through the phone screen while my stomach twisted into knots. David had found the facility. He'd gone there deliberately, armed with whatever information his investigation had uncovered about my employment history and the government's cover story. Everything I'd done to protect him, the isolation, the silence, the refusal to return his calls, had backfired completely. Instead of accepting my distance as a sign that our relationship was over, he'd interpreted it as evidence that something was wrong and needed to be fixed. His concern for my welfare had driven him directly toward the source of the danger I'd been trying to keep him away from. I pulled up satellite images of the Kenton area on my computer, zooming in on the coordinates where the facility had once operated. The government had done a thorough job of demolition, reducing most of the buildings to rubble and concrete barriers. But satellite photos showed obvious signs of incomplete destruction. Foundation remnants, partially collapsed underground sections, areas that looked like they'd been sealed rather than completely eliminated. If David had climbed through the perimeter fence, if he'd explored those remaining structures, he might have encountered biological material that the cleanup teams had missed. The parasites had demonstrated remarkable resilience during the original outbreak, surviving in host tissue for extended periods before activation. Specimens stored in laboratory containers might remain viable even after months of abandonment. I opened the gun safe and checked my ammunition. 3 bullets remained in the cylinder, the same 3 I'd been counting for months while waiting for signs of my own infection. But if David had been exposed to parasitic material at Kenton, if he was carrying those organisms back toward populated areas, the immediate threat was no longer to myself. I needed to know exactly what he'd found at the facility and how much contamination he might have encountered. The social media post had been time-stamped 2 days ago, which meant David was probably already back in Kansas City, potentially spreading infection through normal daily contact with coworkers, friends, anyone he encountered. But calling him directly would violate the quarantine protocols I'd maintained for 6 months. If he was infected, direct communication might give the parasites access to information about other potential hosts. The creatures had demonstrated sophisticated intelligence during the Kenton outbreak, learning facility layouts and coordinating attacks with strategic precision. Instead, I accessed David's cell phone records through methods the government had trained me never to discuss. His location data showed the expected pattern: travel from Kansas City to Kenton, several hours spent in the facility area, then a return journey with stops for gas and food. Normal behavior for someone conducting investigative research, except for one troubling detail. His phone had remained active during the entire Kenton visit, taking photos and possibly video documentation of whatever he'd discovered. Digital files that might contain evidence of the government's biological research program, images of parasitic specimens or laboratory equipment that could expose the cover story Agent Clark's team had worked so hard to maintain. More importantly, those photos represented proof that dangerous biological material remained at the supposedly cleaned facility. If David had photographed viable specimens, if he planned to use that evidence to confront me about what had really happened, he might be carrying active parasitic organisms without realizing it. The timeline was becoming clearer. David's investigation had led him to Kenton 2 days ago. He'd spent several hours exploring the facility ruins and photographing whatever he'd found there. Now he was back in Kansas City, probably planning his next move while unaware that he might have been exposed to the same organisms that had killed my coworkers. I pulled up the facility's original blueprints, documents I'd accessed during my early months of paranoid research. The underground storage sections had housed dozens of containment units, specialized containers designed to preserve biological specimens under controlled atmospheric conditions. If the demolition teams had focused on surface structures while leaving the underground areas partially intact, those containment units might still exist. And if the units had been damaged during demolition, if containment seals had been compromised, the preservation fluids might have leaked into the surrounding environment. Anyone exploring those areas could encounter active parasitic material through skin contact, inhalation, or accidental ingestion. The government's cleanup protocols had been designed to eliminate visible threats while maintaining the cover story about industrial accidents. But Agent Clark's team might have prioritized speed over thoroughness, sealing dangerous areas rather than completely sterilizing them. The monthly check-ins and continued health monitoring suggested they weren't entirely confident that all threats had been neutralized. David's phone record showed 3 days of normal activity after his return from Kenton. Work, home, routine errands that indicated he felt fine and hadn't noticed any immediate health effects. But the parasites required time to establish themselves in host nervous systems, remaining dormant for days or weeks before beginning their infiltration process. I had to assume he was infected and plan accordingly. I checked the cylinder for the 100th time. 3 bullets, enough to handle whatever David might become if the parasites activated, enough to stop any spread of infection, enough to end my own life if exposure became inevitable. But the immediate priority was preventing him from making contact with anyone else who might become infected. If David was planning to confront me with evidence from Kenton, if he intended to demand explanations I was legally forbidden to provide, I needed to be ready for that confrontation. The security cameras showed empty driveways and quiet woods, normal afternoon shadows, but David's car could appear at any moment, bringing infected organisms directly to my doorstep. The isolation I'd maintained for 6 months was about to be tested in the worst possible way. I disconnected my computer from the internet and wiped the browser history, eliminating any evidence of the surveillance I'd conducted. If government monitoring systems detected unusual activity in my online searches, Agent Clark might intervene before I could handle the situation privately. The house felt smaller suddenly. Every entrance I'd secured against outside threats could also prevent escape if David arrived carrying the kind of contamination that had destroyed the Kenton facility. The steel plates over the windows, the reinforced door locks, the motion sensors, all of it was designed to keep dangers out, not to contain them once they were inside. I moved through my established routine of checking locks and camera feeds, but the actions felt automatic rather than reassuring. David's investigation had changed everything, turning my defensive preparations into potentially useless gestures against a threat that was already approaching. The phone record showed his last location update as Kansas City, but that data was 12 hours old. He could be anywhere by now, driving toward Tulsa with photographs of parasitic specimens and questions I couldn't answer without violating federal law. 3 days. That's how long the original Kenton victims had remained without symptoms before the parasites activated and began their neural infiltration. If David had been exposed during his facility exploration, if contaminated preservation fluid had made contact with his skin or respiratory system, he might have 48 hours remaining before the organisms established control. I sat in my monitoring chair and watched the camera feeds, waiting for a blue Honda to appear on the gravel road that led to my house. The loaded pistol rested on the table beside me, safety off, ready for whatever version of my brother might arrive at my door. The afternoon stretched into evening without any sign of approaching vehicles. But David's investigation had created a countdown that I couldn't stop or reset. Somewhere in Kansas City, my brother was probably experiencing the early stages of parasitic infection while planning a confrontation that would force me to make choices I'd hoped never to face. The isolation was ending whether I wanted it to or not. The blue Honda showed up on camera 4:17 p.m., driving faster than David usually took the gravel road. I'd been watching the feeds for hours, but seeing his car actually show up felt like watching a nightmare become real. He parked crooked in my driveway, not bothering with his usual careful positioning, and climbed out of the driver's seat with movements that looked wrong somehow. Even through the security monitor, I could see something was off about the way he walked. His normal, confident walk had been replaced by a stiff, robotic way of moving that reminded me of people fighting to stay in control of their own bodies. David moved toward my front door like someone walking through thick mud, each step requiring conscious effort. The pounding started immediately, not his usual measured knocking, but frantic hammering that made the reinforced door frame rattle. Through the audio pickup, I could hear him shouting my name between impacts, his voice carrying a desperate edge I'd never heard before. "Mike, open the door. I know you're in there, and I know what happened at that facility." I stayed in my monitoring chair, watching him through the camera while my hand moved to the pistol on the table, 3 bullets in the cylinder. David showing up at my house meant the countdown I'd been dreading had reached 0, but seeing him actually standing there made it impossible to think clearly about what needed to happen next. His pounding grew more violent, both fists hitting the door one after another while he continued shouting. The sound repeated through my house like gunshots, destroying the silence I'd kept for 6 months. Between impacts, I caught pieces of what he was saying. Demands for explanations, references to the Kenton facility, accusations about government cover-ups. I went there, Mike. I saw what was left. I have pictures. You need to tell me what really happened. The mention of pictures confirmed my worst fears. David had not only visited the facility ruins, but documented whatever he'd found there. Digital evidence of biological specimens that were supposed to have been completely destroyed. Proof that the government's cleanup operation had been incomplete. After 10 minutes of hammering, the pounding stopped suddenly. Through the monitor, I watched David step back from the door and look directly at one of my security cameras. His face filled the screen, and what I saw there made my stomach drop. The confident, healthy brother who'd visited in February had been replaced by someone who looked like he was dying. David's cheeks had become hollow, creating sharp angles where his face used to be rounded. Dark circles surrounded his eyes, which seemed to have sunk deeper into his skull. His skin had taken on a grayish color that made him look like he hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. Most disturbing was his expression, a combination of desperation and confusion that suggested he knew something was wrong but couldn't identify what. "Please, Mike," he said, speaking directly to the camera. "I'm sick. Something happened to me at that place, and I need to know what kind of research they were doing there. You're the only person who can tell me what's going on." The admission that he felt sick took away any remaining doubt about what was happening. David had been exposed to parasitic material during his exploration of the Kenton ruins, and the organisms were beginning their infiltration process. The timeline matched perfectly. 2 days since his visit. Just enough time for the creatures to establish themselves in his nervous system. I stood up from my chair, the loaded pistol in my hand. Opening the door would violate every quarantine protocol I'd maintained, but leaving David outside while he underwent parasitic transformation would be worse. At least inside my house, I could control what happened when the creatures activated fully. The walk to my front door felt longer than the entire building. My hands shook as I worked the multiple locks I'd installed, each dead bolt requiring conscious effort to turn. The steel plates over the windows remained in place, but opening the door would breach my defensive perimeter in a way that couldn't be reversed. David stumbled inside before I'd fully opened the door, moving past me with the unsteady movements of someone fighting to maintain balance. His breathing was shallow and rapid, the kind of respiratory distress that came before complete systemic failure. Up close, his deterioration was even more obvious. Clothes hanging loose on his smaller frame, hair that looked brittle and unwashed, fingernails with dark crescents underneath that might have been dirt or dried blood. "Jesus, Mike, you look terrible," he said, though his own appearance was far worse than mine. "How long have you been living like this?" I locked the door behind him and turned on the steel window covers, sealing us both inside the house. The usual sound of machinery dropping barriers into place felt different now, like closing a tomb rather than keeping a fort safe. David was inside my quarantine zone, bringing whatever contamination he'd picked up at Kenton directly into the space I'd worked so hard to sterilize. 6 months, I told him, watching his face for any signs that the parasites were beginning their activation sequence. Since I left that job in Kenton. David nodded like this confirmed something he'd suspected. He pulled a manila folder from inside his jacket. The folder bulged with papers and what looked like printed photographs, evidence of his investigation into the facility's real purpose. "I know it wasn't a mining operation," he said, settling onto my couch with visible relief. "I found the real tax records, the government contracts, the medical reports about cleanup workers who got sick afterward. Whatever they were studying there, it wasn't coal or natural gas. I stayed near the door, keeping my distance while trying to figure out how much time we had before he got worse. The original Kenton victims had gone downhill fast once symptoms showed up, minutes rather than hours before the parasites took complete control. David opened the folder and spread photographs across my coffee table. The images showed the facility's underground sections, partially collapsed lab areas, and what looked like damaged containment equipment. In several photos, I could see the specialized storage units that had housed biological specimens, their clear chambers cracked and leaking preservation fluids onto concrete floors. Some of those containers were still intact, David said, pointing to a photo that showed a row of undamaged preservation units. I could see things inside them, specimens that looked like they were still alive. What kind of biological research was the government conducting there? The question hung between us while I looked at the photographs. David had been much more careful than I'd expected, recording evidence that the cleanup teams had missed or deliberately ignored. The containers he'd photographed that were still whole might still contain living parasitic specimens, organisms that could survive for a long time in controlled preservation environments. But more troubling was the possibility that he'd made direct contact with leaked biological material. The photos showed him standing close to damaged equipment, preservation fluid pooled on surfaces where he might have placed his hands or equipment. Any skin contact with that contaminated liquid would have been enough for parasitic transmission. "I can't tell you what they were studying," I said, which was true in multiple ways. The legal agreements I'd signed prohibited disclosure, but even without those restrictions, explaining the truth would put David in more danger than he was already facing. David's expression moved from pleading to frustrated. He tried to stand up from the couch, but had to grab the armrest for support, his coordination already messed up by whatever was happening inside his nervous system. When he looked at me again, his eyes had a glassy quality that reminded me of the early stages of parasitic infiltration. "Something's wrong with me, Mike. Ever since I went to that place, I've been getting sicker. Headaches, vision problems, trouble sleeping. And there's this feeling like something's moving around inside my head." The symptoms matched exactly what Dr. Hayes had written down in his research files. Parasitic invasion started with brain problems as the organisms made pathways through brain tissue. The feeling of movement was caused by parasites physically digging through nerve clusters, creating new connections that would eventually allow complete motor control. Blood began trickling from David's left nostril, a thin red line that traced down to his upper lip. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, staring at the blood like he couldn't understand where it had come from. More blood appeared from the same nostril, flowing faster now as parasitic activity increased pressure within his skull. "Mike, what's happening to me?" I'd seen these exact symptoms at Kenton, watched my co-workers undergo identical deterioration before the parasites took control. David's timeline was speeding up, probably because his immune system was fighting the invasion more aggressively than the original victims. The organisms were responding to resistance by increasing their infiltration rate. David's eyes rolled back suddenly, showing only white while his body began convulsing on my couch. His limbs jerked with the mechanical movements I remembered from the facility, muscles contracting as parasitic filaments established connections to motor neurons. Blood poured from both nostrils now, along with a thin stream from his left ear that indicated the creatures had reached his auditory canal. I grabbed the pistol from the table and checked the cylinder again. 3 bullets, same as always. Under the skin of David's scalp, something was moving. A visible bulge traveled from his ear toward the back of his head, creating a raised line that pulsed with deliberate purpose. The parasitic organism was positioning itself for emergence, preparing to extend beyond his skull for better access to sensory input and motor control. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though David was no longer in a condition to hear me. The convulsions had stopped, leaving him motionless on my couch with blood covering the lower half of his face. His breathing had become shallow and irregular, the kind of respiratory pattern that preceded complete system shutdown. David's eyes snapped open, completely white with no visible pupils or irises. His head turned toward me with the jerky, mechanical movement I'd witnessed during the Kenton outbreak, neck rotating at an unnatural angle while his facial expression remained completely blank. Behind his left ear, a pale appendage began coming out of his scalp. The parasite moved out slowly, testing the air with tiny sensors while making its first connection to David's body. Within minutes, it would take complete control over his movements, turning him into the same kind of threat that had destroyed my co-workers. I raised the pistol and aimed at the center of David's forehead. My hands were steady, muscle memory from years of firearms training taking over when conscious thought became impossible. The creature hadn't noticed me yet, focused entirely on making its connections. The gunshot was loud in my sealed house, bouncing off the walls like thunder. David's body jerked once and then went completely still, slumping against the couch cushions while blood spread across the fabric behind his head. The parasite kept moving for several seconds after the impact, writhing blindly before finally going limp. I set the pistol on the table and sat down beside my brother's body. The photographs were scattered across the coffee table, evidence of his investigation mixed with his blood. In death, David looked peaceful for the first time since he'd arrived, the tension and confusion finally gone from his face. The crying started without warning, deep sobs that felt like they were tearing something loose inside my chest. I'd spent 6 months preparing for the possibility that I might have to kill infected people, but nothing had prepared me for the reality of shooting my own brother. David had died trying to help me, seeking answers to questions that had gotten him killed. Through the tears, I realized the government had lied about everything. The cleanup at Kenton had been incomplete, leaving viable specimens in underground storage areas where curious people could encounter them. Agent Clark's assurances about specimen destruction and facility sterilization had been false, designed to make me feel safe while covering up their failure to contain the threat. Other people would visit the facility ruins drawn by the same curiosity that had motivated David's investigation. They would find the same contaminated areas, make the same fatal contact with parasitic material, undergo the same transformation that had just killed my brother. I opened the pistol cylinder and loaded the final bullet, the one I'd been saving for myself since the beginning of my isolation. The chamber clicked shut with mechanical precision, bringing my ammunition count to 1. Not enough to stop another outbreak, but sufficient for what needed to happen next. David's photographs showed too much evidence, documented too many details about the government's biological research program. If anyone found his body, if they discovered the pictures and connected them to the Kenton facility, the cover story would collapse completely. Agent Clark's team would be forced to handle the situation through methods that might be worse than the parasites themselves. I gathered the photographs and David's research materials, stacking them carefully before carrying the pile to my kitchen. The gas stove provided sufficient heat to destroy paper documents, reducing months of investigation to ash and smoke. The chemical smell filled my house as evidence of government secrets disappeared into the ventilation system. Outside my security cameras, the world continued its normal routine while I sat beside my brother's body and accepted the truth I'd been avoiding for 6 months. The parasitic threat wasn't contained. The government couldn't or wouldn't eliminate every source of contamination. People would continue dying until someone found a way to destroy the organisms completely. But I wouldn't be alive to see how the situation developed. The loaded pistol felt heavy as I held it, preparing for the last decision I would ever make. David had become the final victim of my involvement with the Kenton facility, and I had become the last witness to a threat that was apparently beyond anyone's ability to contain. The isolation was ending exactly as I'd always known it would.